Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with potato chip pizza. That's right, the first time I saw potatoes offered as a pizza topping, I thought that was one of the dumbest things I'd ever seen. But then I tried it, and I realized if done properly, potatoes can be a fantastic pizza topping. The only problem is they're extremely hard to do properly, since they need to get cooked through by the time our crust is done. Which, long story short, led me to try potato chips, which, much to my amazement, worked out astonishingly well. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with our least interesting and exciting step. And that would be rubbing a nice heavy-duty sheet pan with a little bit of olive oil, followed by a light dusting of cornmeal, which is our basic pan prep when we're simply going to bake a pizza. And we're not going to be messing around with stones or peels or any other special pizza making equipment. And once that's set, we can move on to shaping our dough. And for this, I'm using exactly 1/2 batch of our Wolfgang Puck pizza dough recipe, which I like to shape into an oval before rolling it out. And as you might know, rolling out pizza dough is very much frowned upon, since they say you're crushing and pressing out all the air bubbles, which is totally true, and I'm not saying it doesn't, but what I am saying for this pizza, it doesn't matter. Okay, if we were doing something like a pizza margherita, then I would go with a much wetter, much stickier dough, and not roll it. So the final product would be more delicate and airy and bubbly, not to mention thin. But when we're talking about a potato pizza, I think the crust needs to be a little more substantial and dense. Which, by the way, is why I chose the Wolfgang Puck recipe, which is my go-to pizza dough when I am going to put a lot of toppings on. So as they say, the right tool for the right job. And for me, rolling out this slightly drier pizza dough really does work best for this application. But regardless, we're going to roll this out to 1/8 of an inch thick. And while you can do any shape you want, of course, I'm going to have to insist, for this you roll it out into the shape of a potato. Alright, for potato chip pizza, that's the rule. And then once that's been accomplished, we'll go ahead and transfer that onto our pan. And then once that's been positioned, I like to go around giving it a little bit of a finger tipping, which probably really doesn't do too much, but it sure feels good. And at this point, we can go ahead and start layering on our toppings. The first of which would be a generous application of pesto, which hopefully, of course, is homemade. But I'm happy to report the quality of store-bought pesto has been going up lately. And in the spirit of full disclosure, I will admit, today I'll be using my favorite already prepared jar. And the amount we want to put on should be exactly in between not enough and too much. Okay, I want to see some, but not too much crust showing through. And by the way, make sure you have enough to save a couple tablespoons for the top, since we're going to drizzle that over after this has been cheesed and chipped. And speaking of cheese, once our crust has been spread with the pesto, we can scatter over the first of our 2 cheeses. And for cheese layer number 1, I'm using a very sharp white cheddar. And we are not going to put on a ton. And as you can see, I'm going almost, but not quite to the edge, with both the pesto and the cheese. And then once our cheddar's down, we can move on to applying a nice generous layer of chips. And personally, I do recommend using a plain chip. Okay, these were just sea salt flavored kettle chips. And while we do want to be fairly generous, and I'm definitely going to overlap the chips, I found the best results with doing just 1 layer. Okay, if we pile our chips up too high, it doesn't seem to work out quite as well. But having said that, you go ahead and put on as much as you want. I mean, you are after all the Norman Bates of your crispy carbohydrates. Oh, and if you're lucky, your bag will have lots of these folded over ones, which seem to work especially well for this. And what we'll do after we have this covered is maybe take another handful or 2 and try to tuck them in here and there. So if you see any kind of gaps, go ahead and slip another chip in. And then once that's been accomplished, we will take a couple tablespoons of our pesto, and we will thin that out with a little more olive oil, just so it's not quite as thick, and maybe a little bit easier to drip over the top, which is our next step. And while we don't want too much, I do like to have a little bit of this thinned out pesto on the top, so we'll go ahead and drip and drizzle that as shown. Oh, and speaking of oil, because we're sort of piling up these toppings pretty high, and we went almost all the way to the edge, we are not going to get much browning on that exposed dough. So if we want to try to get a little more color, we could go around and brush that dough with a little bit of olive oil. But I wasn't overly concerned, so I didn't bother. But I just thought I would throw it out there in case you were looking for one more thing to do. But anyway, once we've dripped over a little more pesto, we'll go ahead and add some raw sliced red onions, which I guess like all pizza toppings are optional. But I think in this case, they really do help tie everything together. So if you're asking me, they are mandatory. And then after the onions, we'll go ahead and apply cheese number 2, which would be some grated mozzarella. And please don't use that wet, juicy, fresh stuff. Okay, we just want to use your basic supermarket variety, also known as low moisture. And that's it. We'll go ahead and finish up with a little drizzle of olive oil over the top. At which point we'll head to our preheated 500-degree oven. But we're going to make a pit stop on the way. Since as you might know, when I use a sheet pan for pizza, I like to give the bottom a head start over a high flame for a few seconds, just until I hear it start sizzling, which is going to help our bottom crust brown up nicely. And it's only going to work if you're using a heavy-duty sheet pan and not one of those flimsy cookie sheets. And that's it. Once we hear that sizzling, we'll go ahead and transfer that into the center of a 500-degree oven for about 12 to 15 minutes, or until our potato chip pizza looks like this. And of course, the exact time is going to depend on how thick your dough was and how much stuff you put on. But at 500 degrees, I'm guessing about 12 minutes should be pretty close. And then I do like to let this rest for about 5 minutes before I try to cut it, which if you have one, I like to do on one of these cooling racks. And no, I have no idea what that little finger slide was. That was kind of weird. But anyway, rack or not, we'll let that rest about 5 minutes, at which point we'll transfer it onto a cutting board, and we'll find our pizza wheel and portion this up. And if everything's gone according to plan, not only should you have some nice browning on the top, but the bottom of your crust should be nicely browned as well. So yes, contrary to popular belief, you can definitely get a decent texture on your pizza crust, even without using a stone. So that was looking pretty good. But enough show and tell. Let's move on to lift and bite. And that, my friends, if you're a fan of potato top pizzas, is going to be a revelation. Okay, even compared to a perfectly made traditional potato pizza, this I believe features a better overall texture, plus an even more intense potato flavor. Not to mention this being like 100 times easier to pull off. Since using the traditional method, you have to slice your potatoes to the perfect thickness so that they're perfectly cooked and tender by the time the crust is done, which is actually very challenging, which is why they're usually sliced very thin. But when they're sliced thin, you don't get a lot of potato, so you don't get a lot of potato flavor. And yes, I've tried thicker slices of potato that have been cooked ahead of time, but it just doesn't give you that same texture as when you do it with the raw potatoes. Whereas this, however, gives you the exact same texture. And by same, I mean even better, as these do retain a little bit of crunchiness here and there. So to summarize, this potato chip pizza is no gimmick, but simply, in my opinion, a superior way to build a potato pizza. So I could not have been happier with how this came out. Other than maybe I wish I had a little bit more color on the edges of the crust. And as I mentioned, you could brush it with oil, which would help a little bit, but probably not too much. You would also have to leave more exposed dough, which I don't like. Okay, I'm not a crust guy, and quite often the birds that live in our yard get to enjoy that later on. But anyway, that's it. What I'm calling potato chip pizza. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go put some pizza on top of potato chips, so as to rebalance the equilibrium of the universe. And while I'm doing that, I really do hope you give this a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.